This is Political Psychology, and I'm your professor, Dr. Patrick Stewart. In this lesson, we will be dealing with how biology and media technology interact in the political arena. We already know how important visual processing is from a brain sciences and psychological viewpoint. So with this segment, we consider the political communication contribution to understanding the connection between politicians and their followers. One thing that we all do is create images of ourselves to present to the world. In the past, these images were ephemeral and transient. Now, with social media, our images are lasting and widely disseminated snapshots of ourselves and how we want the world to view us. With each self-presentation, we make decisions regarding how people see us. And, as we know by now from this class, visual representations are the first things processed by our brain and often the most important thing processed. What you see here is my self-presentation on one social media site I frequent. The emphasis here is upon my wife and, yes, my incredibly cute daughter. Blue is a color that works well for me, and I'm wearing clothing that emphasizes my being just another ordinary guy wearing everyday clothing. My facial display behavior, and those of my wife and daughter, are those of happiness and affinity with each other, as is our body language, in which we are in close proximity to each other. And with our daughter in between us, you can see that she is the center of our family life. Mass media coverage of politicians is much more professional and thoughtful than anything I could possibly do with my social media site. So it makes sense to understand how our political leaders attempt to influence our perceptions of them. We develop connections with our leaders based upon a combination of self-presentation and video editing, meaning that the media has incredible power to influence our perception of leaders. Media coverage of political figures reprises the face-to-face interpersonal connections between group leaders and followers that we had even just a few centuries back. We humans, like other primates, would know who our leaders would be on a personal basis, especially if we lived in small groups. As a result, what we see on television is an illusion of what was seen in humanity's evolutionarily adapted environments. When we think of what leaders are supposed to accomplish, it is mainly to respond to threats to their followers to ensure they survive and thrive. Here, we see the process by which environmental events and new viewers interact in dealing with any sort of traumatic event. What is key in this model is appreciating that leaders are not leading until they show up on the scene to galvanize their followers, which often involves bringing members of the opposition into the fold. This is what rally events really do. They unite a nation behind a leader, with citizens putting their differences behind themselves to protect their shared social identity, even if just for a moment. That doesn't mean that such traumatic events cannot be used by politicians to maintain support. The 1997 movie, Wag the Dog, was just such an example as it sardonically portrayed a Bill Clinton-esque figure using a fake war with Albania to hide a sex scandal from the public. And while no direct connection has been confirmed, during incumbent President George W. Bush's 2004 re-election effort, terror warnings were regularly raised within a few days of his challenger John Kerry seeing an increase in his poll ratings. Regardless of the events faced, whether in a leadership position for a political entity or running for office, to be a good politician, an individual has to be able to connect with voters. That means knowing what the potential voter's social identity is and taking part in activities that reflect that social identity. The best way of accomplishing this is to be seen as a group's leader by engaging in that group's activities, whether that means eating local foods, engaging in local sports, or taking part in local forms of entertainment. Here we have an image of Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson looking up while alongside other candidates in a toad race in 2018. This occurred during Conway, Arkansas's Toad Suck Days, which happens the first weekend in May, and provides a chance for statewide primary candidates to show off their toad racing skills, and, more importantly, their good natures by trying to win the toad race. Because people think mainly in terms of images, not specific policy preferences, being seen getting down on your hands and knees to race toads means so much more than any policy-based press conference, especially here in Arkansas. In this section, we will be dealing with the question of how candidates running for a political office present themselves and, in turn, are presented by the media. As we have discussed, there is a systematic struggle for frame control between candidates and their handlers with the media. The campaigns want to make sure their candidates are seen as positively as possible, while the media sees their function as the public's watchdog. In other words, the press sees themselves as the public's eyes, ears, and, at times, their conscience by reporting on political events and politicians and holding them accountable when necessary. For their part, the candidates want their message to reach the public as unmediated as possible. Since Dwight D. Eisenhower's 1952 presidential candidacy, when he used Madison Avenue marketing strategies and tools to win the presidency, to the current day, candidates and their handlers have worked to craft candidate images. Perhaps most telling is the work of Dick Morris, who worked both sides of the political aisle as a gun for hire when he was part of Bill Clinton's 1996 presidential campaign. As noted by Grabe and Busey, Morris' view was that there was a vital synergy between issues and image. Rather than the presidential stand on the issues creating the desired image was first identified, then congruent issues were selected that best promoted the new image. Image molded and directed the political agenda, not the other way around. This image crafting has reached new peaks with new technologies, both with the crafting of candidate images and with campaigns attempting to craft the images of the opposition. According to Betsy Grabe and Eric Busey, there are three broad categories of how candidates are presented in the media visually. Two of these frames, that of the ideal candidate and the populist campaigner, are considered of great benefit to the candidates as they convey leadership traits seen as highly important, that of competence and that of trustworthiness. The third type of visual frame is one no candidate wants to be portrayed as. It is that of the sure loser, and is either something a candidate stumbles into or is portrayed as such by their opposition. This means that the opposition will either try to convey the absence or the antithesis of competence and trustworthiness in hopes of defeating their opposite number. These images are crafted visually through two major approaches. The first is that of the associational juxtaposition. Associational juxtaposition occurs when the qualities of one object or person is transferred to another through sequential depictions. An example of associational juxtaposition is when you show an American flag followed by a shot of the candidate to communicate the candidate's patriotism. The second major approach is referred to as mise en scène, a French term for environmental context. Mise en scène occurs when a candidate appears in an environment conveying the values that they want to convey. For instance, showing a candidate in front of an American flag will be an example of using mise en scène to communicate patriotism. The ideal candidate is what we expect our very most prestigious individuals running for office to look like. It includes such indicators of statesmanship as showing the candidate with other elected officials and people with power, status, and money, whether at the national or at the local level. Being seen with symbols of patriotism such as the American flag, monuments, memorials, military machines, and parades, as well as with symbols of economic or technological progress, such as Wall Street and high technology tools, are typical visual framing approaches. Being surrounded by an identifiable entourage with security, aides, and often in a motorcade as well as with campaign paraphernalia that has the candidate's name on posters, banners, signs, and clothing, certainly helps, as does political hoopla with confetti, streamers, and balloons identifying the political party. The ideal candidate must be able to induce a high level of perceived trustworthiness as well. As a result, displaying forms of compassionate behavior is important, with examples of this including appearing and interacting with children, as well as with family members, and having reaction shots or background footage of women showing awe, excitement, or other signs of approval. Likewise, being shown at or in juxtaposition with places of worship and being amongst religious figures and symbols shows connections with the values of a community. Finally, making affinity gestures such as waving, giving the thumbs up, hugging, shaking hands, and in general giving individual attention to well-wishers, even without physical contact, builds perceived trustworthiness. The first step to being a populist campaigner is to dress and to do things that ordinary people do. This means wearing informal attire, which includes khakis, jeans, shirts without a tie, or with the sleeves rolled up. It also means wearing athletic clothing and playing sports that normal people play, which can depend on the culture, as well as being engaged in physical labor that shows how healthy and strong the candidate is. Populist campaigners also need to establish their normal, everyday people credentials by showing their mass appeal. This means appearing with other individuals who possess mass appeal, which means that people the public like, including celebrities from television, the movies, and now social media, as well as with musicians, athletes, and other entertainers. It also means that the audiences themselves like the candidate and show it that they're being present and enjoying themselves alongside the candidate. The last thing a candidate wants to be visually portrayed is as a sure loser. Of course, this means that the opposition wants to see this type of candidate portrayal shows up in the media. Having small crowds or crowds that disapprove certainly does not help develop perceptions of trustworthiness or enthusiasm for the candidate. Likewise, displays of weakness or showing inappropriate behavior affects perceptions of competence quite negatively.